Boldwood presents The Orphan Daughter, written by Sheila Riley and read by Marlene Sidaway. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Summer 1946. 19-year-old Evie Kilgaren gathered her mane of honey-coloured hair into a loop of knicker elastic before taking a vase of heavy-scented lilies and freesias into the kitchen. The flowers were barely faded when she'd rescued them from the churchyard bin that morning. Placing them in the centre of the table, she hoped their heady scent would mask the smell of damp that riddled every dwelling in the row of terraced houses opposite the canal, and add a bit of joy to the place. "Who's dead?" her mother Renee asked. Her scornful retort was proof she had already been at the gin, and Evie's heart sank. She had wanted today to be special. Surely her dead father's birthday warranted a few flowers. Even if they were knockoffs from the church, at least she had made an effort, which was more than her mother had. "I got them for Dad's—" Evie was silenced by the warning flash in her mother's dark eyes, a warning she had seen many times before. Renee gave a hefty sniff, her eyes squinting to focus, her brow wrinkled, and her olive skin flushed. Evie knew that when her mother had drunk enough mother's ruin, she could be the life and soul of any party, or, by contrast, won over could make her contrary and argumentative. "I thought they'd look nice on the table," Evie answered lightly, quickly changing her answer to try and keep the peace. She should have known better than to mention her father in front of Leo Darnell, who'd moved in as their lodger 6 months ago and taken no time at all getting his feet under her mother's eiderdown. "I found a vase in—" Her voice trailed off. Her mother wasn't listening. As usual, she'd disappeared into the parlour to darken her finely shaped eyebrows with soot from the unlit grate. Makeup was still on ration, dolling herself up for her shift behind the bar of the Tram Tavern. The tavern was barely a stone's throw away on the other side of the narrow alleyway running alongside their house, so why her mother felt the need to dress to the nines was anybody's guess. Out of the corner of her eye, Evie noticed a sudden movement from their lodger, who was standing near the range, which she had blackleaded that morning. Leo Darnell didn't like her, and that was fine, because she didn't like him either. He was a jumped-up spiv who tried to pass himself off as a respectable businessman. Respectable! He didn't know the meaning of the word, she thought. Her eyes taking in the polished leather Chesterfield suite that cluttered the room and seemed out of place in a small back-street terraced house. "None of your utility stuff," he'd said, pushing out his blubbery chest like a strutting pigeon. All the time he had a wonky eye on the bedroom door. He would do anything to keep her mother's suite, and made it obvious every chance he got to show Evie she was in the way. He'd been very quiet for the last few minutes, Evie realized. That wasn't like Darnell. He was up to something, she could tell. He hadn't interrupted with a sarcastic comment, as he usually did when she and her mother were having a tit-for-tat. His self-satisfied smirk stretched mean across thin lips as he hunched inside a crisp white shirt and peered at her. His beady eyes looked her up and down as he chewed a spent matchstick at the corner of his mouth, before turning back to the grate. His piggy eyes were engrossed in the rising flames of something he had thrown onto the fire. Her attention darted to the blaze, casting dancing flares of light across the room. "No!" Evie heard the gasp of horror and disbelief coming from her own lips. How could he be so callous? How could he? As he stepped back with arms outstretched like he was showing off a new sofa, Evie could see exactly what he had done. "You burned them!" Evie cried, hurrying over to the range, pushing Darnell out of her way and grabbing the brass fire tongs from the companion set on the hearth, desperate to save at least some of the valuable night school work. 2 years of concentrated learning to prove she was just as good as all the rest, reduced to ashes in moments. Thrusting the tongs into the flames again and again was hopeless. Her valuable notes disintegrated. "Ma'am, look what he's done!" Her blue eyes blazed as hotly as the flames licking up the chimney. "You are not the only one who can crawl out of the gutter, Mr. High and Mighty." Evie was breathless when her burst of anger erupted, watching the flames envelop her books, turning the curling pages to ash. She balled her work-worn hands, roughly red through cleaning up after other people, and pummeled his chest. "Why?" She caught his mocking eyes turn to flint before being dealt a quick backhander that made her head spin. Her nostrils, which only moments before had been filled with the sweet fragrance of summer freesias and mansion polish, were now congested with blood as traitorous tears rolled down her cheek. Evie dashed them away with the pad of her hand, ashamed and angry because he was privy to her vulnerability. Her pale blue eyes dashed from the range to her mother, who was now standing in the doorway shaking painted nails. "That evil bastard burned my exercise books. They had all my notes in them, 2 years' work gone up in smoke." She had scrimped and saved every penny for the books from her measly wages, earned from skivvying in the offices of Beamer's Electricals. "Oh, are you calling a bastard?" Darnell was not the biggest or strongest man she had ever come across, but was no less intimidating. Leaning into her face, his carefully enunciated words through nicotine-stained teeth dared her to retaliate. "You had better watch your mouth, my girl." "I'm not your girl," Evie spat the words. "My father would have made 10 of you." If his ship hadn't impeded a German torpedo back in 1943, she thought. If he was here now, there'd be no need for a jumped-up racketeering lodger. "I pay the rent in this house." Darnell's voice was low and menacing. "And if you don't watch that attitude, you'll be out on your ear." "And you reckon you'll be the one to do it?" Evie knew she was skating on thin ice, challenging Darnell. He had no compunction about hitting her, although never when her mother was around, and always with the threat that if she opened her mouth, he would make life very difficult for them. But he had slipped up this time. Her mother could see what a snake he really was, and would throw him out for sure. "Don't backchat, Leo," her mother said. "He's been very generous to us." Surely her mother wasn't going to side with his so-called businessman, who was as slippery as a wet fish and operated his crooked empire under the radar of the local constabulary from their front parlour. "Oh, well, in that case," Evie answered with a withering sarcasm that could match her mother's. Rarely stooping to the lowest level of communication, she felt this occasion called for it. Her mother coveted the money he brought in, blinded by the gifts he plied her with, no questions asked. It became apparent to Evie her mother would not allow anybody to spoil their cosy set-up, not even her own daughter. "He's good to you. That's all that counts, isn't it, Ma?" Evie detected a flinch in her mother's posture. Really liked to think she was still vibrant and desirable. There was no room in her life for words like Ma. "I've studied hard to get qualifications that could get me out of this bombed-out dump. I'm doing my final exam tomorrow." "Surely your friends will lend you their notes if you ask. What about Susie?" her mother said, blowing her nails dry while Darnell hovered in the background. Evie let out a snort of derision, recalling the taunts of her lifelong nemesis, Susie Blackthorne. Evie trusted her own sound knowledge before she would ask that scatterbrain. "I don't have friends." Evie shot her mother a meaningful glance. She had been discouraged from making friends to look after her young brother and sister before they were evacuated to Ireland 7 years ago. Then the war came, along with the Yanks, her mum's favourite servicemen. Evie had locked herself in her room to avoid them while the good people of Reckoners Row tut-tutted their disapproval. "You wouldn't even let me go to Ireland with Jack and Lucy. I was a 12-year-old child who had to stay home because her mother couldn't face being alone." That's not the reason, and you know it. Her mum glared at her, silently warning her not to say another word. Rennie suddenly changed the tone of her voice when Evie remained silent. Surely there's someone you can ask. Honestly, you make a mountain out of an anthill. I'm not like you, Ma. I don't ask people. I prepare. I study. I get the job done under my own steam. Evie knew her mother had no hesitation in asking for anything. Splash the cash, make things better for poor Rennie. You're too bloody independent. That's your trouble, Rennie said, gingerly pulling out a straight-back chair so she didn't smudge her nails. I shouldn't need to ask anybody, Mum. I've worked hard on those notes, and he knows it. Evie knew Darnell wanted her out. Will someone sit the exam for me, if I ask nicely too? Don't be sarky, Rennie said, applying another coat of Cutex nail polish in young red to her bullet-shaped talons, while Darnell poked the ashes of the 2 years' work through the glowing coals. You've got a job. Why can't you be satisfied? I don't want to clean up other people's mess for the rest of my life, Mum. Evie had skivvied all her life and yearned for something better. She wanted to be like the girls who dressed smartly in twinset and pearls. I don't want to be the dog's body doing everybody's bidding. Evie's eyes blazed. I am more than a skivvy. You've got a very high opinion of yourself, Darnell sneered. Evie refused to respond to his arrogant put-down. A reply would provoke him into the row he wanted. She continued as if he hadn't spoken. Can't you see not every girl wants to depend on a man, Mum? I don't want the same kind of life you've had. She would not fall prey to the first man who showed any interest. What thanks do the women round here get for cooking, cleaning, and popping out babies until they have nothing left to give? She wanted to be independent, successful. I want to be someone. You'll be someone in Ford Cemetery if you give me any more lip. The threat rolled off Darnell's tongue like spit off a hot iron, and Evie knew he could put fear into most people, but he didn't scare her any more. I know your little secrets, she said, with a nod of her head to strengthen the hidden threat of betrayal, satisfied her words hit home when she noted a flicker of alarm. I know you hide your contraband in our cellar, and as God is my judge, she continued, strong in the knowledge she had found his Achilles heel, I will see my day of you, Leo Darnell, but I won't have to sink to your level to do it. You arrogant bitch! He raised his hand to strike her again, but Evie was quick to get out of his path, causing his hand to flounder in mid-air. Even though his earlier heavy-handed slap had caused her nose to pop, Evie would not back down to this contemptible man any longer. She looked to her mum to see if she would intervene, and when Rennie did nothing, Evie shook her head in disbelief. It had come to something when even her own mother wouldn't defend her. Is there a chance you'll bring Jack and Lucy home soon? Evie turned her impotent fury onto her mother. Or have you forgotten you've got a 14-year-old son and a 10-year-old daughter? Maybe they don't count until they're earning. Is that it, Mum? She wanted to hurt her mother in the same way she was hurt. Tell her to mind her own bloody business, Rennie. His belligerent tone told Evie she had the upper hand, and it gave her courage to speak her mind. You're nothing but a coward who refused to fight for his country, not like my brave father, a real hero. Hardly, from what I've heard, Darnell answered scathingly, but Evie ignored his remark. His words were worthless to her. You're nothing but a conniving conchi who spent the war years hiding in attics and cellars. He'd built up his crooked empire when good men went to fight, and as a regular in the local tavern where her mother worked, she wouldn't be surprised if he'd had Rennie wrapped around his little finger even then. You wouldn't be so quick to take the high ground if our Jack was here. A 14-year-old kid, Darnell sneered. I'm shaking in me boots. Jack might be 14, but he was as strong as an ox. Working on a farm in Ireland, he and Lucy ate good fresh food. Evacuation had done her siblings the world of good. They were the picture of glowing health the last time she managed to visit. But this was their home, where they belonged, and she missed them so much it hurt. "We were doing fine until you showed up." Her angry eyes were transfixed on the crimson spray of blood on Darnell's singlet, and Evie realized she had gone too far when he lowered his head. All the while his eyes were fixed on hers, circling her, never letting her near the door. Flinty-eyed, he was like a bull ready to charge. The only question was, when? She could just make out her mother hovering to the side. Would she come to her aid if need be? The tight grip of his hand around her throat was swift and forced her lips into an O of humiliation. In the process, the back of his hand clipped her lip, and another spray of blood splashed his white shirt. Evie heard a small gasp coming from her mother, sitting near the open sash window. "Leave her alone, Leo." Rene's tone sounded calm to the untrained ear, but Evie knew better. Her heart pounded fiercely. Mum would throw him out this time, surely. But it soon became apparent that Rena would do no such thing when her tone suggested she would only contain the situation. "She didn't mean anything by it, did you, Evie, love? Tell him." For those few moments, after she admitted knowing where he kept his contraband, Evie thought she had won the battle, but it was quite clear victory had slipped from her grasp. "I mean it, Rene. If she doesn't belt up—" He didn't paint a picture. Elaboration wasn't his style, but his vice-like grip said enough. Evie sensed her mother's agitation, but doubted she would intervene. Darnell got away with murder where Mum was concerned. Loosening his grip, Evie slumped, rubbing her throat, fighting back the tears. "Go and see if our dinner's ready, love." Rene relaxed visibly, screwing the top back on the bottle of nail varnish. "My mouth's watering, thinking about that lovely piece of silverside Leo brought in." Why did her mum always have to chivvy him out of a bad mood? "This lot round here would give their eyes for a decent joint of beef," Darnell said, pushing out his pigeon chest and stretching to his full 5 feet 9 inches. Rene was glad she didn't have to intervene. He had the means to deliver expensive, albeit knocked off, meat when some of the neighbours couldn't even afford spam. "We've had steak twice this week, aren't we the lucky ones?" she said, humouring him. "Black market meat isn't something to brag about," Evie said under her breath, feeling her stomach tighten in disgust when her mother gave him a look that held a promise. "I'm too good to you." Darnell's cocky reply gave him a swagger. "You had nothing when I came here. Now look." His stubby, ring-covered fingers spread to encompass the oxblood leather suite, the dining table with 4 ladder-back chairs that matched the mahogany sideboard, her mum's pride and joy. "I would have the whole street in to show off my posh new furniture," Rene said. "There's not many who can afford silk drapes." Not just curtains, Evie thought with venom. Her mother loved the idea she was on the up, as she called it. There'd always been an element of them and us where her mum and the neighbours were concerned. "I'm not allowing the great unwashed over my threshold," Darnell growled, checking himself out in the mirror over the fireplace. Since when did it become your threshold, Evie thought, but didn't voice her question, knowing he would only kick off on her again. Great unwashed, indeed. The people who lived round here might not have much, but they had their pride, and they did their best with what little they had. Darnell had grown rich on their hunger for anything that would relieve their grim existence in this bomb-scarred port, and never failed to remind them of his ability to come up with expensive goods still on ration. "I was expecting a delivery, and it isn't where it should be," said Darnell. Evie's eyes trailed to the cellar door, and then to the fire before the penny dropped. She knew why he'd burned her books now. Darnell was vindictive. Her suspicions were confirmed with his next words. You refused to take in the delivery, didn't you? It wasn't really a question, Evie knew. It was an accusation. More likely, the reason he burned the valuable work she had strived so hard to produce. His delivery was obviously contraband: booze, cigarettes, ration books. The valuables he hid down in their cellar could put him in Walton jail for years. Stuff that people who worked all the hours God sent could not enjoy unless they had the readies, because money was the only language Darnell understood. Nobody called today, and nothing was delivered. She lifted a defiant chin, wanting nothing to do with any of his dodgy black market schemes. She couldn't trust herself to look at him. If she did, she might crack him over the head with the brass tongs she still had in her hand. "I'll put a left hook on that chin if you don't lower it," Darnell warned. And Evie, knowing he meant every word, turned to her mother, who gave a slight warning shake of her head. "Come and keep me company at the table, Leo." Her mum was sitting at the table by the open sash window, fanning herself with the news of the world, and her eyes darted a silent warning. "Let's have the wireless on. Listen to family favourites." "You don't want to see him for what he is, do you, Mum?" Evie's shaking voice was barely above a whisper. Everybody knew Darnell was a crook who enticed people with his money, then cowed them into dependency. Well, not me, Mum, not me. She would rather spit in his eye, but that would mean sinking to his level, and it would be a cold day in hell before she sank that low. "Evie." Her mother's green eyes were pleading, but Evie had a stubborn streak. "You expect me to back down to this bully?" Evie said, as she headed to the kitchen door. Darnell took the seat near her mother and dashed away a buzzing blue bottle. She flinched, causing a satisfied grin from Darnell and a slow shake of her mother's head. His amusement was plain to see when he pulled a fat cigar from a silver case. Flash bastard, Evie thought. She'd seen men with families who had to work every hour in grease and grime, bad weather and worse. They shared match-thin hand-rolled cigarettes on a pin just to get that one last puff. Cigars, an unheard-of luxury, were beyond the prospect of dock and factory workers who occupied Reckoners Row's line of neat terraced houses. "We don't need a lodger, Mum." Evie's voice became a high-pitched squeak. "You've got the job in the pub, and as soon as I've finished my course, I can hang up my mop bucket and get a secretarial job at Bemis. They pay decent money, and my tutor said she'd give me a good reference." Having worked as an office cleaner at the electrical works since she left school at 14, Evie longed to climb the ranks to office clerk, to better herself, to save the money to bring her siblings home from Ireland, and to hell with Leo Darnell. Her mother's eyes implored her to be quiet as Darnell picked up the Sunday newspaper and rustled it noisily, drowning out the wireless and the heartfelt messages to families of soldiers still serving abroad. Evie swallowed angry tears of injustice that threatened to spill onto her bruised cheek. The spiv would have to go before the authorities came sniffing around and they all ended up on the street. Hurrying out to the scullery, Evie's tears fell onto the huge piece of meat he had supplied the day before. Preparing the tray, which her mother had borrowed from the Tram Tavern and had conveniently forgotten to take back, she heard him passing through on his way to the lavatory down the yard. This was her last chance to try and talk some sense into her mother. Quickly, she filled the tray, and elbowing the door open, she hurried back into the kitchen. "Ma'am," she pleaded, brushing away the tears once more, "we can't go on like this, walking on eggshells when he's around, talking in hushed voices when he's resting his eyes. What have I told you about that mouth of yours running away with itself?" Her mother's eyes darkened, and Evie felt a cold hand turning her racing heart to ice. She was beaten. Her mother was onto a good thing and would not let Darnell go in a hurry. What's the use, she thought. Mum was hardly going to take her side over his, but Evie knew she must try and make her see sense for both their sakes. "Are you going to let him treat us like dirt under his shoe?" she asked. banging the tray so hard on the table it made the cups rattle and upending the salt cellar. "You're not saying that when you're eating the good food he brings in," Rennie countered, absent-mindedly throwing spilt salt over her shoulder. "You get on my nerves, the pair of you." "What's got you spooked, Mum?" Evie asked, plucking the skin on her fingers, sensing her mother was holding something back. "You don't usually give in to him so easily." "Leave it, Evie," Rennie warned. "There are some things I can't talk about, things you wouldn't understand." "By God, he's got you well trained, Mum." Evie slowly shook her head. Something wasn't right. Evie Kilgaren wasn't the kind of woman who scared easily, and certainly not by the likes of Darnell. No, Evie suspected her mother had something more troubling on her mind. Why else would she be so blasé about the way the Spivs treated her eldest daughter? "This has nothing to do with Leo," Rennie answered. "All I can say is, ask no questions and I won't have to lie." Rennie's face, still handsome, if somewhat lifting, was now pinched with worry. Evie recognised the expression. She had seen that look often when Dar had been home on leave too long and they had no money. "He needs locking up, ma'am," Evie said. "He's as crooked as his own front teeth." "He's got a good heart," Rennie answered. Out of habit, she pinched the lit end of a half-smoked cigarette, putting the remains on the mantelpiece next to the clock for later. Evie knew her mother was trying to distract her from asking too many questions when she raised the volume on the wireless. "Did you forget Leo bought this wireless when you were singing along to Vera Lynn?" "If he paid for that wireless, I'll eat my hat," Evie snorted. "If he's so generous, why won't he let you have the money to bring Jack and Lucy back? This is their home, too, remember?" Rennie picked up the cigarette she had just extinguished and relit it. Evie could tell she was nervous for some strange reason. "I can't bring them home just yet, and I do want to, believe me." "Throw him out, then," Evie countered, hands on hips. "I can't. I need his rent money, and never you mind what for," Rennie said quickly. They were so engrossed in their exchange, they didn't hear the back door quietly close. Then, more quietly, Rennie said, "Evie, if anything ever happens to me, just remember, I could not burden you with the ugly truth." "I will never trust him," Evie said, imagining her mother was still talking about Darnell. "I've seen his runners taking the betting slips from hard-up housewives, traipsing down back alleys, rummaging in their penny pockets for an extra penny or two. If they haven't got the cash, he lets them have the bet on trust, with a huge interest charge thrown in for good measure." "It's up to them if they fancy a flutter," Rennie defended Darnell. "He doesn't put a gun to their heads. Anyway, it's not him I'm talking about." "Then who?" Evie asked angrily. "That's enough, Evie." But Evie wasn't listening. She was getting into her stride. "Why is he lodging in a dockside back street when he can afford all these luxuries? What about his smart house in Formby by the sea?" "He's got to be here, near his work." Rennie knew he could not bear to sever all ties with the busy port he grew up in, nor could he bear the wife he'd left behind. "It's no use trying to get through to you, Mum, not when you're in this mood." She would never throw Darnell out. The expensive presents he brought home kept her sweet. "Evie." There was a note of caution in her mother's tone that told Evie she should say no more. Women who made men look small around the tough dockside streets did not go unpunished. "He's the lodger. He's got no right." The slightest nod of her mother's head was a warning that reduced Evie to silence. All her life she'd been told to keep her eyes open and her mouth shut, say nothing, no matter what she saw. But should I? Evie thought rebelliously. This man was nothing to her, and she didn't want to stick around to see him rule her mother with fine things. An easy life was seductive to a woman who had nothing, she supposed, but she didn't have to stay around to see it. "You want to watch that mouth of yours, girl." Darnell's voice accelerated Evie's heartbeat immediately, and she spun around. How much had he heard? Enough, if that grim expression on his face was anything to go by. She would have to brazen it out, even though her legs didn't feel strong enough to hold her. "And why do I have to watch what I say?" she countered, picking up the boiling hot earthenware teapot. If he lifted one finger to her again, he would regret it for the rest of his life. "Go and see Connie," her mother, sounding defeated, lowered her head and stared at the floor. Her voice was barely audible as she added, "She's got a spare room." "But, Mum—" Darnell's firm grip on her arm silenced Evie. The action told her he had won. He had got his way. Stunned by her mother's betrayal, Evie glared at both of them, repulsed. "Evie," her mum didn't look at her. "There's a small suitcase on top of the wardrobe." Her mother's conquered tone spoke volumes, her words a sharp slap. Devastated, Evie took the stairs 2 at a time. Her own mother had disowned her. Even as she bundled up what few possessions she owned, Evie willed her mother to come into the small back bedroom and tell her it was all a misunderstanding. But she didn't. "Keep your bloody suitcase, Mum," Evie said to herself as she filled a pillowcase with her few measly belongings. "You never know when you might need it." She would see her day of both of them. "I've been looking after myself for years. It makes no difference now." Wondering how a mother could choose a man over her own kids, she didn't look back at the sparsely furnished bedroom before slamming the door shut behind her. "I wouldn't stay here if you paid me," Evie shouted as she reached the bottom of the stairs. Nor would she beg Connie for a room. Evie would find a place of her own. "When he tires of you and you haven't got someone fetching and carrying for you, it'll serve you bloody well right, Mum." Her fiery words carried through the closed kitchen door as Evie hurried down the narrow lobby. Grabbing the brass doorknob she had polished that morning, she gave the front door of the 3-up, 3-down red-brick terraced house a hefty slam. The narrow street was teeming with noisy kids. Boys in short trousers were swapping bits of shrapnel left over from the war, while young daredevils cooled off by diving from the bridge into the grotty canal. Every front door was open, except theirs. Darnell didn't like fresh air, or neighbours calling in for a natter. Breathing in the dusty heat, she couldn't recall the last time their front door stayed open until bedtime, like everybody else's. "Evie, your nose is bleeding." Danny Harris, hurrying down the steps leading to the bridge, stopped when he got to Evie's gate. He leaned on the granite post of the gate she had just opened, and his deep, authoritative voice gave Evie cause to cover her face with her hands. Film star handsome and tall as a door, Danny was a sergeant in the King's Own, and the last person she wanted to see right now. Feeling bedraggled, she noticed his indomitable mother, whose thick leg-o-mutton arms were tightly folded across a stately bosom, keeping watch from her front gate. It was common knowledge Ada Harris thought her family were a cut above the Kilgarens, and she made no secret of her disdain. 10 out of 10 for observation, soldier." Evie's feeling of irritation turned to humiliation as she fumbled for a handkerchief while trying to ignore Leo Darnell's voice carrying down the lobby and through the closed front door. His furious expletives were proof he hadn't yet finished this fight. "Here, let me help," Danny said, putting down the heavy-looking kit bag that had been slung over his shoulders as if it weighed nothing. Evie felt a rising panic. She didn't want Danny mixed up in her fight. Breathing hard, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and said the hardest word she could muster. "You can mind your own bloody business and keep walking." Her words, spoken with plausible conviction, dampened the pitying expression that flitted across his handsome features, and gave Danny no choice but to back off, probably believing she meant every syllable. Evie's blue eyes were wide with fear. "Fair enough," he said amiably, "if that's how you feel." Picking up his kit bag, he gave her a smart salute before making his way down the street towards his disapproving mother. Evie knew that Ada Harris would not condone her precious oldest son fraternizing with a common skivvy. Even though Ada was a cleaner in the Tram Tavern next door, She described herself as the housekeeper. Watching his retreat, Evie brushed a strawberry blonde curl from her pretty freckled face as a ship's horn gave a low moan in the nearby dockyard. It sounded just how she felt. There must be something better than this, she thought, momentarily distracted by Leo Darnell's cronies huddled in the shadow of the bridge playing an illegal game of pitch and toss. The waterfront was crammed with people scratching an existence and making do, but she didn't want that. She wanted to make something of herself, depend on nobody. She would not emulate her mother or live off the corrupt earnings of a villain. Before she closed the gate at the end of the short, tiled path, the front door opened and was slammed shut again, her mother's voice loud and piercing, as if she was struggling to keep the argument contained. But Evie knew that was not going to happen when the door suddenly flung open with such force it bounced off the lobby wall. She had no time to flee as Darnell launched himself down the path. His strong hand gripped her long fair hair that had escaped the double loop of knicker elastic. Forcing her head back onto her shoulders, the pain slicing through Evie's head and neck was nothing compared to the sudden thundering slap that caught her side on. "Go to Connie," her mother hissed, trying to hold Darnell back. "She'll see you right." Chapter 2. "Isn't someone going to help that poor mare?" Connie Sharp, pulling pints behind the bar of the Tram Tavern, could hear the desperation in Evie Kilgaren's voice over the din of Sunday afternoon drinkers. "If it's not my missus," said a man gazing into his pint, "then it's not my concern." Connie thrust a pint of dark mild beer onto the bar in front of him and rang the loud clanging bell. 10 minutes for you lot to drink up and bugger off home," she called in a voice that brooked no argument. Working a dockside pub, she had to be tough, but fair. The drinker's attitude did not surprise Connie. She knew that local men, suited and booted, wanted to enjoy their pint in peace after a hard week's graft on the docks, and did not involve themselves in another man's argument. Lifting the counter flap after serving the last customer, she slipped from behind the bar, dropping it with a bang behind her. "Sharp by name and sharp by nature, that one," said a bent-nosed stevedore through a fog of old Holborn. "I wouldn't leave her 10 bob short in her wages, that's for sure." Connie shot him a dagger of disapproval, but he didn't care as he downed the dregs of his beer. "Mind your own manners, you," Connie said, her marine-coloured eyes blazing as she stormed across the checkered floor and headed towards the window. With innate certainty born of growing up in this tough port where noise, dirt and poverty were a fact of life, local law dictated people keep their noses out of another man's business, and for the same reason they expected nobody to poke their snout into matters that did not concern them. But Connie did not think like that. "I'm dying of thirst over here," someone called, rapping the bar with a silver shilling. "Then die quietly." Connie threw the words over her shoulder. "The bell went for the last orders of the afternoon 10 minutes ago, so when you've snuffed it, I'll send for your Aggie to come and cart you off." It was a good thing the pub closed at 3 each day, otherwise this lot would carry on drinking till they had no money left to spend. She was sure they had hollow legs, these tough, hard-working dock workers who barracked and bantered without malice. Well, most of them anyway. Unlikely as it sometimes seemed, she knew this was a close-knit community who had fought a war together. They'd lost loved ones, their homes, and even their children, some departing to long years of evacuation, others to eternity. Nursing in Italy during the war, Connie knew enemy raids on the nearby docks and railways had almost brought Merseyside to its knees, especially this dockside area of North Liverpool, where the life force of the country's existence ebbed and flowed every single day. But the local community of stout-hearted women whose husbands had gone to war staved off starvation and bowed to nobody, not even the enemy. They were not beaten then, and looking out of the window, Connie could tell by the sound of their robust jeers they weren't broken now either. "Why would Rennie give house room to that spiv? Leave her be, you bully!" a neighbour yelled from her front door, obviously alerted by the disorder outside the tavern. "You wouldn't hit her if she had her father behind her." The women of Reckoner's Row were gathered at the bottom of the bridge near the tavern, watching the commotion with interest, although keeping a respectable distance. "That mother of hers is no better than she ought to be, neither," Ada Harris called, scurrying up the street in carpet slippers so as not to miss anything. There's no show without punch, Connie thought, watching the tavern cleaner join the gossiping swarm. The women, clownish through shared hardship and misfortune, were less inclined than the menfolk to keep their opinions to themselves. But Connie knew they'd give their old man a blow-by-blow account over Sunday dinner, whether his nibs liked it or not. "They're going at it hammer and tongs!" 10-year-old Bobby Harris had stopped collecting the glasses, a little job he did on Saturday and Sunday afternoon, to help Connie and for pocket money. He was on tiptoe looking out of the window, craning his neck to get a better view. He winced when he saw Evie being dragged out into the street by her long sand-coloured hair. "Evie's giving as good as she gets, but she's no match for the spiv." Everybody in Reckoner's Row called Leo Darnell the spiv, although never to his face. "I bet a pound to a pinch of horse shit Rena comes into work with another shiner," Connie said, peering over Bobby's head to get a better view. Her concern was growing as she added, "It's not like Evie to get into an argument in the street, and certainly not with the spiv." Pushing up the net curtain to get a better view, she ignored Bobby dragging a wooden crate. "Rennie jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire when she took up with that crook. You'd think she would have more sense." Connie never imagined the barmaid would take up with the spiv after suffering that bloody husband of hers. Frank Kilgaren, an outside angel if ever there was one, was a tyrant in his own home. He'd done Rennie a huge favour when he got himself blown up in the Atlantic. But Leo Darnell was notorious for dealing in the black market and other nefarious activities. His arrogance sickened Connie, who knew he had Rennie just where he wanted her, hiding his contraband in Rennie's house while his own house in Formby, near the posh seaside resort of Southport, was squeaky clean. He wouldn't shit on his own doorstep, Connie thought, skewering him with an unflinching glare, but he didn't mind sullying Rennie's. The man was a thug who could silence the bar just by walking into it. "Ma said he's Rennie's lodger," the boy said, and Connie's dark eyes rolled heavenward. "Some might call him that, Bobby." Connie's voice betrayed the revulsion she felt. Since Frank's ship went down, Rennie was like a caged bird set free. "It's Evie I feel sorry for," Connie said. "That girl hasn't had it easy. Maybe it's just as well the younger two are still in Ireland." Although not one to judge, 30-year-old Connie had standards. Rennie's riotous revelry was the talk of the street. After Frank copped it, visiting servicemen were often late-night visitors, especially during the war. Bobby clambered aboard the upturned crate and rested his chin on the wooden sill to get a better view of the crowd outside. The women of Reckoner's Row, like cooing pigeons, huddled near the wooden railings lining the Leeds to Liverpool canal, lambasting the sweaty man. "He's lost the buttons off his shirt, and his vest is splattered with blood," Bobby exclaimed, wriggling on the crate. Certainly had a splinter in his knee. "But whose blood is it?" Connie wondered out loud. She dug her nails into the palm of her hands, wishing she were a man who could knock 7 bells out of the spiv when he lunged at the pretty girl in a torn dress. Connie noticed Evie was too quick for him and had the good sense to step out of his way. Moving from the window, Connie slowed her pace at the door and watched as Rennie hurled herself down the narrow path of the red-brick terraced house, her bare feet slapping the rust-coloured tiles as she lunged into the tangle of arms. Dragging Darnell's hands from her daughter's waist-length hair, Rennie stumbled into an untidy heap when Darnell pushed her away and Connie tensed. Gasping for breath, Rennie scrambled to her feet, pushing back the bottle-blonde hair sticking to her damp face and dragged her daughter out of harm's reach. "That poor girl," Connie said, pressing her lips into a stiff, straight line, aware that on a sweltering day like today, every door in the single row of jerry-built terraced houses would be open. The boy should not be witness to such a carry-on, she thought. He should be home eating his dinner. Bobby was the youngest of Ada Harris's 3 kids. An accident, Ada called him, even within his earshot, and they lived at the other end of Reckoner's Row, next to the small bridge and the debris. "Bobby, did I just hear your mum calling you?" Sometimes this wasn't the place for a 10-year-old boy to spend his time. He should be down on the debris with the rest of the kids, playing football or cricket. The debris was the space where the 2 houses adjoining his own home had been blown up during the war. Luckily, Bobby had been evacuated and his family were in the air raid shelter. His older brother Danny, fighting on the beaches at Dunkirk, had also had a lucky escape, while Ada's only daughter, Grace, was a stewardess on an ocean-going liner. All in all, Ada Harris and her family led a charmed life, but the same could not be said for Evie Kilgaren. "I don't want to go home. I'd rather stay here with you," Bobby said, his cheerful face turning a shade of pink under the usual muck that accumulated during his normal day, and Connie ruffled his unruly mop of dark hair. "If I know anything, Ada will have your guts for violin strings if you're late for your Sunday dinner," she warned. "Mum's got our Danny to talk to. He's home on leave, so she's not interested in what I get up to." Bobby was still looking out of the window, and his candid observation pulled on Connie's heartstrings. She sighed. The boy might be right. Ada was besotted with her oldest son, and told anybody who would listen how proud she was of his bravery during the war. "Who needs a war when you've got this on your own doorstep?" Bobby said, as if privy to her thoughts, his eyes glistening with excitement. "I love a good scrap, don't you, Connie?" "No, Bobby, I do not." Her voice was sharper than intended, "especially when it involves poor Evie. She doesn't deserve to be treated that way. No kid does." Sickened by events outside, the oppressive heat was making her unusually irritable, and Bobby turned, his face a crumpled frown. "Didn't you want kids of your own, then?" he asked with childlike innocence. "Don't you tire of asking questions?" Connie asked, returning to her duties and whipping up the beer-stained bar towels. She lashed them into the sink with such force the water splashed over the bar. Of course she wanted children of her own, but that joy was not to be. There was no use fretting about it. "Why don't you go and get your dinner and stop mithering me?" The pub had been busy since she opened up until closing time, and she was looking forward to putting her aching feet up for a few hours before the night shift, although she doubted she would get much peace. Mim, her mother, would want every tiny detail of the fracas, even though she had the advantage of a front-row view from behind the lace curtains in their living room upstairs. After a few moments, Connie realized she had unsettled Bobby with her hasty retort, and she felt a pang of remorse for being so short with him. He wasn't a bad kid. He just got up to mischief when left to his own devices. But what 10-year-old didn't? "I'm sure you must be starving," she said, her voice softening. "A growing lad like you?" She relaxed when his sudden cheeky grin let her know they were pals again. Having given up hope of having children of her own, she often treated Bobby like the son she never had, and he took full advantage of her kind heart. "Do you know everyone round here, Connie?" Bobby asked. "Aye, Bobby, I'm like the fixtures and fittings," she answered, drying another glass and putting it on the shelf above the bar. "Didn't you want to get married?" His forthright manner never ceased to raise an eyebrow. "I mean, you're not that old. I'm sure someone would have you." "I'm fine the way I am, thank you." Connie busied herself putting glasses behind the bar, so he couldn't see the smile turning up the corners of her generous lips. A former nurse, she had served in France and Italy during the war, and Bobby was always asking questions about her time there. She thrilled Bobby with stories about the heroic deeds of the brave servicemen, although remaining deeply private about her own war, especially to Mim. Her mother didn't need to know about the secrets that had cost her the nursing career she loved. Being the type of woman who didn't think too deeply about things she had no control over, Mim wouldn't understand why she couldn't face returning to nursing after Italy. So when Mim said she'd had enough working days behind this bar, Connie took over the reins. Wiping a damp sheen from her brow, Connie pushed the thoughts of those terrible Italian days from her mind, realizing too much time had been ruined by things she had no power to change. Sighing, she weaved an escaped russet tendril back into the victory roll that haloed her head, and as Bobby approached the bar with more empty glasses, she forced a practised smile. "You've got nice eyes, Connie," he said. "They change colour when you smile." Tilting his head to one side, his expression was quizzical. "Are they green or blue?" "They're sky blue pink," Connie answered with skilful nonchalance, repeating the phrase her mother often used when she was a child. "Sometimes they even turn red when I get angry." She made a playful lunge towards him, flicking a damp tea towel, laughing when Bobby curled his skinny body to protect himself, his delight echoing through the empty bar. "I like it when you're in a happy mood," he said, unfurling and taking advantage of her good humour to straighten a box of Smith's crisps under the counter with keen-eyed precision. "You look, well, younger," he said, stepping back to make sure the half-filled box was just the way it should be. "I doubt that," Connie raised a cynical eyebrow. She suspected Bobby's angelic face and easy compliments would make him a heartbreaker like his older brother Danny one day. "You do it a lot, you know," he said, straightening the packets inside the box. "Do what a lot?" Connie stopped what she was doing and eyed him with light-hearted suspicion. She was being soft-soaped, and surmised Bobby wanted a packet of crisps. She nodded to the box, and he eagerly helped himself. "Smile! You smile all the time," he said, taking his snack and resuming his place by the window, looking down the row, waiting for something else to happen. "Everybody's friend, that's you, Connie." "Aye, if you say so, Bobby," Connie sighed, watching him open the twist of navy-blue waxed paper from inside the bag of crisps and dipping his finger into the salt. He turned his face towards her, and she laughed when his right eye bunched and his mouth stretched into a shuddering grimace. "That'll teach you not to eat salt," Connie said, rinsing soapy water from her hands. Bobby was quiet for a while, crunching away, his mind on other things. Then a couple of moments later, he surprised and delighted Connie when he suddenly said, "I wish you were my mum, Connie. You'd make a great mum," he said. "My mum won't let me do nothing." "Your mum won't let you do anything," Connie corrected him, folding bar towels. "That's what I said," he answered, engrossed in sprinkling more salt onto his crisps, while Connie swallowed the tight knot in her throat. Bobby didn't know he had just paid her the biggest compliment. But it was no use wondering, longing to know what it would be like to have a child of her own. That time had passed. "You don't have to say some daft things, Bobby," Connie said, after taking a calming deep breath. But she realized he wasn't listening any more. "Connie, come and see!" Bobby's tone was urgent, their previous conversation forgotten. "They're at it again. The spiff's just clocked to one." The crate he perched on wobbled, his impotent anger clear as day. "I wish I was big like our Danny. I'd give him what for." Connie rushed from behind the bar, and this time she headed straight to the open door to see the throng of irate neighbours gathered like clucking hens. Her heart pounding and her mouth dry, Connie hoped one of the gambling men would intervene, but none of them did. They wouldn't take a chance of getting on the wrong side of Leo Darnell, a mortal foe among those who crossed him. The spiv was holding Reenie at arm's length while grabbing hold of Evie. "You show her who's boss, Leo," one of his followers called, stooping low in the mouth of the jigger, playing an illicit game of pitch and toss. "Put her in her place." "You want to mind your own business," Connie told the gambler. "I've heard you're not slow in running from your wife's rolling pin." The other gamblers and a few women roared with laughter, while Connie, shrewd as a hunting cat, eyed Darnell's every move. Her heart went out to the poor girl who had become a source of entertainment for the local kids who ceased their afternoon games to gawp at the carry-on from number 2. Connie itched to set Evie free. "I think she's had enough." Connie's voice was loud and firm enough for all to hear. The way Evie was being treated sickened her. Darnell let go of both women and rolled up his sleeves, enjoying the sport as Connie met his contemptuous gaze without fear. "I said enough." There was a hint of menace in her voice. "This is a private matter, Connie." Rennie sounded apologetic, standing with arms outstretched between her daughter and her fancy man. Connie knew Rennie was a proud woman whose dignity was tested only when there was a man around. But for all that, Connie liked her and counted her as a friend and confidant. "It doesn't look private, Rennie." Connie edged forward. "You could sell tickets." "Mind your own," Darnell sneered, ignoring the calls from the increasing throng of concerned women. "I'll show you whose business it is, shall I?" Connie answered, turning her attention back to Rennie, who looked quite dishevelled after her tussle with Darnell. "You ought to be ashamed, brawling in the street, making a show of yourself." Connie kept a close eye on Darnell's balled fists, watching him bob and weave like a boxer limbering up for the big fight after Evie wrenched her arm from his grip. "Gobshite!" Having lived in the Dockland all her life and owing Darnell nothing, Connie had no fear of the black marketeer. "You need to put those fists in your pockets where they'll do no harm." Connie's voice was clear in the sultry summer heat. "If you lay one more finger on that poor girl, I'll have the jacks on you." She knew Leo Darnell had a healthy regard for staying under the radar of the local constabulary. "You might terrify the poor mare, but you don't scare me." "You nosy old bag," Darnell spat, causing globules of white foam saliva to spurt from his mean lips and cling to his shoestring moustache. Connie shuddered in disgust and walked towards Evie. She would be safer in the tavern, but she didn't manage to reach the stricken young girl. "You want to watch your manners, Darnell." The male voice issued a warning, and Connie's head whipped round. Her heart lifted when she saw Danny Harris sprint up the street, heading straight for the spiv. No 7-stone weakling, that's for sure. Connie could see the army had built Danny up like a centurion, and he was more than a match for Darnell. She smiled when local women in their brightly coloured turbaned headscarves nudged each other and nodded to Danny. "Not so cocky now, Mr. Darnell," one woman shouted. Faced with Danny and in his haste to retreat behind the door of number 2, Darnell pushed Evie with such force she staggered and fell onto the cobbled road. Then, grabbing Rennie by the arm, he dragged her into the house behind him, slamming the front door with a bang. Evie looked dazed and unsteady when Danny scooped her into his arms. The satisfied housewives of Reckoner's Row nodded their approval, although Evie, her blouse ripped and her matted hair streaked with her own blood, didn't look happy at being rescued. "Put me down right now," she demanded, and Connie could see the pink tinge under her splash of freckles. Evie's acute embarrassment was obvious. "Let go of me before I scratch your bloody eyes out." Danny did as he was told, lightly lowering her to the cobbles.